Shall I kick off? Carolee, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this really important meeting for the privilege to throw out a few thoughts that have been burning in my mind, and which this gives me the opportunity to focus and try to cohere. Thanks also for the opportunity to speak on a day in which unemployment in South Africa has risen to its highest, or is reported to have risen to its highest level ever, at 30.8%, according to the narrow, strict definition of unemployment. And I raise that because yesterday a number of contributions made the connection between the right to work and economy, and what it is that causes or violates the right to work. And that, I think, is at the center of our discussion this afternoon. But it's also a useful entry point for me in the comments I want to make, where I've been asked to be provocative, and I am going to be provocative, because it allows me to make my first point in that context, which is to say, this discussion is long overdue and necessary, and that as we consider these issues, we do not have time for incrementalism in the approach to economy and human rights. I tried to put it together as a formula, and I would put it something like this: that the climate crisis, which we didn't discuss much yesterday, plus the COVID-19 crisis, equals an economic crisis, which equals a human rights crisis. And if we don't seize the opportunity and make measurable headway on this issue of economy and human rights, and I would say you need to debate what is measurable headway, but if we don't make measurable headway within half a decade, then I believe that the opportunity the crisis presents will turn to a threat, that the window will close, and that, as people like Philip Olson have said in his report on the climate crisis and human rights, that the failure to use rights to address the human rights crisis, to address the climate crisis, will turn into its opposite. It will turn into a crisis for democracy and for human rights. Now, I'm going to spend most of my 10 minutes talking about giving input on tactics and strategy. That was my brief. But before I do that, I think it's necessary just to, as very briefly as possible, summarize the context in which we are having this discussion. And so I pulled out 5 linked points, each of which could be the whole subject of a talk as the basis for starting this. The first is that I think that in the last 25 years, point number 1, the notion of socio-economic rights became deeply rooted in international and national law, and that has been well documented. However, point 2, the progress in law was not matched by progress in economy and in economics. I might say that economic thinking did not take advantage of the change in legal thinking, and therefore those gains in law when it came to socio-economic rights have not been translated into gains in life, which might itself become a legitimacy problem for human rights and for law. Which leads me to point 3, which is that whereas 25 years ago or 30 years ago, at the beginning of the era of neoliberalism, we could possibly have predicted the chaos that would result, we're now in a position where the damage caused by what I would call rightsless economy has become evident for all, in broken systems that are meant to advance right, broken health systems, broken basic education systems, broken food systems, and broken economies and broken periods, broken people. Which leads me to point 4, which is that we need to recognize that we are now in a period of reversal, which could become a threat to the whole rights project, to the whole human rights project. Now, we've made enormous gains, I think, and I think we often don't pay enough attention to those gains at an international law level, the frameworks, the institutions that have been created to advance rights and to advance socio-economic rights. But those gains, their durability depends upon what happens in the next period. Which leads me to point 5, which takes us directly into the discussion about strategy and tactics, which is that we can continue doing more of the same as social justice organizations, but more of the same will lead only to Pyrrhic victories, and we may win the battle in certain instances, but we will ultimately lose the war. And again, bearing in mind, you've asked me to be provocative, and therefore I'm pushing things to boundaries as I was asked to push things to boundaries. But I believe that whilst we have had numerous successes in the last decade in advancing socio-economic rights, and we've strengthened the standing of the poor in relation to socio-economic rights, that there has actually been an objective, tangible slide when it comes to rights and to quality of healthcare systems. So the question is, what is to be done? What tactics and strategies should we be debating as a way forward out of this convening and out of these discussions? And I want to start that discussion with something that Jason said yesterday in the chat, and I'm going to quote exactly what Jason said. Jason put up in the chat a question: what is more likely to jolt the paradigmatic approach of economic policymakers? Winning the battle of ideas with rights as an ethical construct, or using the coercive force of law and possibly courts to dictate / overturn policy on specific issues? Not mutually exclusive, and being a little provocative here, but the Constitution is not agnostic about poverty, inequality, human rights, and the Constitution is supreme. We just have not imposed the Constitution on economic policy. And I guess that's the strategic question. How do we impose the Constitution on economic policy, and how do we impose economic policy on the Constitution? And put in those two different ways, it creates a different set of tasks and responsibilities for both of us in our respective disciplines of economics and of human rights. So I want to finish just by kind of drawing on my experience as an activist and saying, what do we have in our toolbox at the moment when it comes to activism around these issues, and what is missing, and what perhaps should we be defining as agenda issues for this issue going forward? And I picked out 6 particular tools, which I'm just going to touch on very fleetingly: research, advocacy, monitoring and media, economic and budget literacy, and coming last of all, although not necessarily least of all, to the question of litigation and use of law. So starting with research, you know, I think Gilad was a bit taken aback yesterday when I said in our work group that we shouldn't over-theorize some of these issues, and that there's a danger that we'll tangle ourselves up. And I do think that there's that danger. I think when it comes to research, we have to say, what are narrow down what are the essential research questions, particularly the essential research questions for economy. I think law can be tested out in practice. And I would suggest at least a couple, because I think a lot of our research concentrates too much on critique and reaction and our mobilizing of evidence and analysis, and it has to become more forward-looking. So as I said, I think yesterday, what would human rights really cost and what would they save? You know, we can develop an alternative people's budget and we should say that it should fund human rights, but what would the cost of a human rights budget for health be in rands and cents or dollars or whatever that might be? Is it worth making that calculation? And a similar question, and as I said, what would they save? You know, if we forced investment now in maternal care, in obstetrics, in antenatal care, you know, the current bill that we have of 120 billion rand or whatever it is in medical legal costs and judgment. So also make the point that investment in rights is a saving, not a burden. Investment in the present isn't an accrual against the future, it's a saving on the future. Another question would be, what would be the multiplier effects once this approach took place? You could look at that in relation to quality basic education. So I think there's a bunch of research questions that are linked to action, are of course theoretical, or of course need academic rigor, but they are linked to a strategy. The second is on advocacy, which we're all of us engaged in. Here I would suggest that we need to work out what are some of our core contentions that we agree on, and how do we hammer on them, those contentions, until they begin to take root in public consciousness. And I've listed three. The first is that there's a human rights argument for economic growth. So flip it on its head. Human rights is not anti-growth. In fact, I would go as far as being what's the word, heretical, and saying that human rights could actually be good for capitalism at this moment in time. It might be a road for capitalism out of its economic impasse because of the models of economy that Gilad talked about yesterday. But that would require research to prove that point, and a much more finessed argument than we have developed at the present. A second core contention, I would say, is that, and this shouldn't be controversial, is that economic policy and fiscal policy is not beyond the reach of constitutional law. As I said in the quote from Jason, if a constitution is the supreme law, then it must be supreme over everything. It can't be supreme only over political governance issues, but not over economic governance issues. So we really need to kill once and for all some of the straw men arguments that are put up about why the constitution should not have bearing on issues of economic governance. And the third advocacy issue that I would say is that human rights, that there's a centrality of gender and women's emancipation and equality is linked to these questions of human rights and economy. And again, if you look at the work many of you have done and Oxfam has done and so on care work, etc., these are the evidence is there. So that's the second issue in the toolbox. The third issue in the toolbox is monitoring and media. And so I'm going to be brief here and just say that expenditure monitoring is vital, especially infrastructure spend. You know, we used to have this budget expenditure and monitoring forum, which was limited to HIV and TB. We now have the Budget Justice Coalition, but certainly the work I've just been doing on Gauteng's maladministration and misexpenditure has shown me how much we can learn from very close scrutiny of actual expenditure and patterns of expenditure. And I think we're on the right track there, but I think we need much more than we are doing at the moment. The fourth point would be economic and budget literacy. We don't have economic literacy in civil society. We don't have budget literacy, not even amongst ourselves as the kind of the crust of the economic, of the NGO elite, if you like. We need economic literacy built in communities, built in social justice movement, built in core communities. And that's necessary because, again, somebody flagged it yesterday, this can't just be a debate that takes place between the civil society elite, of which I think we are, and government. It has to go down to ordinary people. And that will bring me to my last point, and I'm nearly there, which is the question, almost there, which is the question of power. And then the last thing on the toolbox is the question of litigation. And I would argue very strongly that we desperately need a cases now to sharpen the debate about economy and human rights. I would argue, even if it's a losing case, I don't think we could be in a much worse position than we are at the moment. I don't think that you could get much worse ambiguities about economy and human rights than those ambiguities that we are bedeviled with at the moment. But if we are to have a cases to sharpen the debate, it couldn't be cases that are just fought out in court. It has to be fought out in the public domain. It has to be a way of galvanizing. It has to be a way of marshalling, compiling evidence, putting evidence and argument into the public domain in a very similar fashion to the way TAC did on HIV, so that it becomes an all of society question. It can't be an issue that's somewhere off on the edges of society. So any discussion of litigation, which I think is critical now, it's not something that we can say, let's do all this homework for 5 years and then we'll think about bringing a case. We need to have cases in motion in the next 6 months. You're asking me to be provocative, so I'm doing what you asked to do. But I seriously mean that, and not necessarily a single case. When we had a discussion on the C19 Food Working Group recently, we talked about the multiple lines of attack around the right to food that are possible at this moment, and how they could be divided. Carolee, I'm almost got 2 minutes left. So those are the things in the toolbox. I want to finish just with 2 points in conclusion. One is that we have to talk about power and how we build power. Civil society is strong on ideas, but weak on power. And we can have the best ideas in the world, but if we're weak on power, we're just a curiosity. We're just a little thing that can be swatted away by Tito and big business and so on and so on. So that has to be part of the discussion. And then my very final point is that I don't think that this issue of economy and rights is an issue that can be tacked onto the edges of civil society organization at the moment. I think it's central to all that we do, which means better coordination as we're doing, and a better division of labor. But I'd also say this, which is that it means an internal discussion within organizations to be sure that everybody agrees on that, and that everybody understands why this is a central question that it should in many ways infuse all of our work. It doesn't mean that we stop our areas of focus, but it really has to run through everything. And I think the point we've reached is a little bit like the point that we reached with TAC when we set it up in early 1999, which is that to make TAC effective, we had to break with the old ways of doing things at that particular moment in time. And sometimes it was required quite a sharp break. So I just throw that out as to provoke the discussion. So that's me. Sorry, slightly more than 10 minutes allocated, but I hope enough to generate some discussion. Thanks very much.